Hey, welcome to another episode of EQUIP, where we're trying to encourage qualities that are undeveloped in parents. And I hope this finds you well. We're going to go through chapter 4 today, talking about the rhythm of community, particularly as it relates to home. Rather than trying to do something where we gather parents all together, I'm shifting and trying to do something that you can access on demand, whether you're going for a walk with the dog or whether you're on a run or whether you are doing drop off or a commute. You can just listen to this on your own. And then, man, I'd love to hear feedback, to hear how this is landing in your home. But I don't know how many of you might have read this article or heard this news report out of Queensland, Australia this last fall. Apparently, 140 high school students showed up for their final ancient history exam, the one that determines college admissions, and they were all primed and ready to write about Augustus Caesar. And they'd spent the entire year studying his reign as Rome's first emperor. The only problem was when they got to the final of it, there was one small problem. The exam was on Julius Caesar. And you go, well, I mean, they're close, aren't they? Well, actually, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar were separated by only 44 years, roughly 2 generations. But those were not quiet years. They were years of assassination and civil war and betrayal and violent transformation. And then the students had studied and knew all about the established empire, the stable reign, the peaceful order. They missed the radical revolutionary transition. And I wonder if we compare that to family life, that's like getting to enjoy the kids without actually raising kids. We have a word for that. I think it's called grandparenting. We can long for quieter days and mature kids who are adulting, but the reality is God forms us while we're forming them. God is discipling us, disciple them, and we can't skirt the sort of tumultuous effort that sometimes is required. Now, just to finish up the story, apparently the curriculum had changed 2 years earlier, but somehow 9 schools in this school district missed the memo. Now, the Minister of Education got involved and the students were actually granted exemptions, but not before experiencing what he called extremely traumatic panic as they frantically tried to cram Julius Caesar into 48 hours. But here's the thing that struck me. While their trauma was arguably well earned, but it earned them their exemption, long before the details of Caesar and the ingredients to his wonderful world-changing salad making empire, they will never forget their experience. You know that's how that works, right? We don't forget the encounter as nearly as much as we forget the data. In fact, they're going to be trying to flip-flop back and forth, trying to remember which Caesar had this, but the experience will live with them and actually probably become a teaching moment for each of them years after the fact. And that's because our brain has 2 core memory systems. There's semantic memory, which is typically left brain, and it speaks to data points. It's textual. It's why we read for knowledge. But then there's the other side that is called episodic memory. And this is the one that stores memories. The thing about memory making, the episodic memory, is that it's 5 times faster than our semantic memory. It's able to connect relationship and metaphors and stories. And the most notable thing I think about this kind of memory system is that it's autobiographical. In other words, it's connected to our identity because we can't separate who we are from our story and our experiences. And particularly as we try and raise up kids, how God has been faithful and God is in it and God is present all along in the hard and the good. So one of the greatest opportunities, I think, for parents to shape the desire for faith or form character and identity is imitation and influence. And the good news about that is we don't actually have to be right to be righteous. The way we lean into Christ's strength being made perfect in our weakness is not actually in hiding or justifying our shortcomings. They're on full display, but owning them to our kids and our spouse. Today, I want to talk about the rhythm of community, which in our family, we had a phrase, sort of a mantra that we would use is save your best for family, believing that if our family got our best, everyone else benefited as well. But family becomes the safe space that oftentimes we try the least hard because, oddly enough, we feel the most safe. And so family gets the sort of leftovers from a stressful day or from a down day. And I like to say one of the greatest places that we can learn the soft skills of Jesus is at home, because there are some things that are more caught than taught. That's the episodic memory. That's the autobiographical story of your life together, specifically in Christ. In fact, we can tell our kids to share. We can require them to say they're sorry to their sister. We can tell them, mandate for them to be kind. But they need to see what generosity, what compassion, what hospitality, what reconciliation actually looks like. We have a whole generation that has a model for conflict, and it's usually not that good, but we also have a whole generation that has really no sense or no model for how to make amends. And this is what family can do like no other. And you don't even have to be perfect. In fact, I was on a run last week and I was listening to an interview with Dr. Martin Shaw, who is a brilliant literary storytelling professor and world traveler. But he made a statement. In fact, several times he made statements on my run, and I just needed to stop, pull out my phone, and type it down. But one of the statements, the first one that he caught me, I was like, hold on, what did he just say? He said, in your incompleteness is your authenticity. I'll say that again. In your incompleteness is your authenticity. See, in other words, it's important that parents get to know ourselves in that space of inadequacy, shortcoming, insecurity, weakness. And then we need to let go of whatever controlling or perfectionistic infatuation we have of who we think we're supposed to be. What if the best way for us as parents to grow in faith and grow our family life is more confession than correction? Don't get me wrong. Kids need correction. They need to be steered. But to what extent does our correction instill shame or make it feel like rejection? My mom had it such a cute way. She might be the least defensive person I know, but growing up, she had a way, a very endearing way of telling on herself. And my dad didn't have a temper. He was soft-spoken, but she would always lead with, Ron, don't get mad at me. I did a terrible thing. I did a terrible thing was her way of saying, it's a mea culpa. It's, yeah, I know I'm at fault here. So how can you actually get mad at that? And it usually meant that she had scuffed the car and or that she had forgotten to do something that someone was counting on. But she just laid herself bare rather than try to justify why she was too busy and shouldn't be bothered with it. I thought that was such a great demonstration, because you really couldn't add on once she said, I did a terrible thing. What are you going to say? Mom, that is a terrible thing. But I think as parents, telling on ourselves is way more formative than operating under the myth that we're without faults or needing to be right. In fact, one of the great phrases we tried to use with our family was save your best for family, believing that somehow if we saved our best for family, everyone else could benefit. And we were really rehearsing what I would call the soft skill of empathy, because empathy is because empathy is going to be more caught than taught. And when we have this moment where we discover, like, oh, that's how that looks, that's how that works. See, childhood is all about me. Maturity is growing up to not be the center of our own lives. It's learning to take turns. It's learning to share. Empathy is simply the ability to learn and share feelings with others and identifying with others' feelings. And we can't learn this through screen time, and we can't learn it through a lecture hall. In fact, we try to do things like, I don't I don't think you meant it this way, but this is how it came across. When you said this, I don't think you intended it this way, but this is how it landed, and it hurt. Um, or when they were learning their language and their vocabulary was limited, a question and ask, like, for a drink, might sound like, I want a drink, and, oh, is there another way you could say that? And it always came out so polite the second time around. Is there another way you can ask that question? Um, in fact, one of the ways I tried to coach or teach empathy and social awareness was, however someone greets you, try and mirror their emotional energy. So imagine greeting someone that you're really excited to see, and you go for a hug, and they stand there at their arms at their side and not even cracking a smile. I said, so if someone greets you by name, use their name back. If someone, like, sticks their hand out to shake your hand, be ready to shake their hand. If someone reaches for a hug, hug them back, and always make eye contact. But the point was, I was trying to get them to monitor other people's emotions so that they can respond in kind. It was just a small step to encourage a kind of empathetic response. Now, empathy, I think, is the pathway for all of us, but especially for our kids, to find contribution. And why contribution matters is because we don't have community without finding contribution. We can learn our potential, but eventually we need to find our contribution too. We've all been around people that felt like they drained us. We've all had relationships that felt like we were always on the giving side. In fact, when our kids were born, they are totally dependent on us. But to come of age or to grow deeper in community means others, and particularly our kids, need to find ways that they contribute for their good, to know that they're not the center of the universe or to orbit their own lives. But there's value in caring for another, not just in receiving. So the questions are, like, how do you teach your kids about their contribution? Certainly you can come up with chores, but more than that, I think, how do we teach them about their influence without necessarily shaming them? I want to share with you one idea that I am putting together as it relates to Lent. Lent is three primary pieces. It's prayer, it's fasting, and it's charity or almsgiving. I like to think of it as compassion. Um, it's a dedicated approach towards the resurrection. We can't just add God to our already mostly good lives and ask him to make it a little better. Death precedes new life. There needs to be a dying to self, a kind of sacrifice before we are made new again. And so I want to encourage families, maybe 2 or 3 families, maybe a small group, maybe a missional community, to go through what I'm calling a new normal. And all of this information is free downloads on my website that you can find. But let me just highlight it. So many parents I talk to wish their kids knew how good they have it. They wish that our kids could be more grateful, or to maybe even work a little harder. The one thing that won't work is telling them as much. Have you had that experience? They definitely hear it, but it's not enough to move the needle of their heart or their will. So what if your family together creatively and relationally leaned into Lent, into the hopes of creating a new normal? So let me just say this up front, especially when it comes to fasting. Lent can feel like a well-intentioned but unsustainable New Year's resolution. But this experiment sustains the fast because of the strength of community and your commitment together. Now, this is, I think, one of the best ways to instill a living faith, an embodied faith that they'll remember as part of their story in family and in faith. They'll not they will not remember what you got them for their 10-year-old birthday or what they got for Christmas last month, but they will remember this shared incarnational faith experiment. So here are the pieces of it. I've put together a prayer guide. It includes just a daily scripture reading from the Book of Common Prayer, but it also gives kind of a thought question. And then I include evening prayers, what has historically been called compline, so that you together can just have an intentional faith expression that feels like something, well, not normal, because we're trying to create a new normal. But then I encourage a fast. And let me explain what I mean by that, because you can choose any of these or all of these, but I've outlined 3 different ones. And these have been some of the most formative things for people that I've been discipling, for the family that I was raising, and for communities that I've led. One fast could be try and fast ordinary and typical everyday purchases. In other words, if you're used to getting your car washed, wash it yourself with the kids, you'll save about $15. If you go out to eat, how about instead of ordering drinks, just everyone order water? I promise you'll save at least $15 just there on Cokes and wine and whatever else. So another example is if you're like have a Starbucks habit, why don't you just fast Starbucks and go with home or office brew? The point is to keep a running tally and identify, stand in solidarity with some of the needs of others around you, and you're creating a little bit of a resource to be able to use later. The second fast would be the World Bank says that about 40% of the world lives on $3.65 a day. So here's the challenge. As a family, try and live on $3 per person per dinner. In other words, a family of 4 would eat for $12 per meal, at least during the weekdays. Weekends could be feasting, but during the week, try and live. It is so doable, and yet it just requires a little menu planning, creative shopping, and, oh, by the way, you got to avoid the drive-through or eating out, but it can be done. We've done this with our kids, and along the way, I just offered a commentary about the global poor, about illiteracy, about food insecurity, about global famine. And all of a sudden, their eyes start to become aware because their food feels less interesting and it's just more modest. And I think this is one of the great ways to shape them without shame, but to help them understand God's faithfulness. Now, the third one is a little bit different, but I would encourage you to just go through your attic, the garage, or the closets in your home and find things that are fasted items. Those items that are still of value, but of little use to you. And would you just post them online? Or maybe together with neighbors or a small group, you just have a yard sale to the glory of God. And this is not your tithe. This is not your offering. This is simply your way to generate resources. Now, what we've done with a family, our community group of less than 100 people, we all did this together. And on Palm Sunday, we gathered up our savings, and we had $1,500, so that on Easter Sunday, we announced it to everyone and then said, in light of the resurrection, we want each of you to try and bring new life to others. In the back today, as you leave, please, every family, take at least one grocery store gift card that's valued at least $25. Take more than one if you want, or take a $50 bill. But over the next 50 days, we want to buy your story. We want you to just give this away. Live expectantly. Live with anticipation. Live with a greater awareness of the needs among you. And see if you can find ways to bring a little life and encouragement. Now, to others. Now, if you've read my books, you understand one of the ways I try and talk about generosity is we don't give to save anyone necessarily. We give simply to save ourselves from believing we deserve what we have. And I wanted my kids to understand that God was the source of every good and perfect gift. And then the second thing is compassion, which is simply learning to see others' needs as different than our own. But in the end, we're all in need of God's grace, and our needs are just different. So I list some different ways that you can save money, that you can shop and do some menu planning. I give some suggestions on how to redistribute funds, but I would encourage you to consider and maybe recruit another family or two how you approach Lent in the next month. We're almost a month away from Ash Wednesday, and I just wanted to put that on your radar because, again, this will be one of the most memorable ways your kids experience a living faith. You know, our native language isn't words, it's not text. Our native language is images, is story and relationship. And we prove it every time we go to bed and have a dream, because none of us dream in words and text. And so when we think about how do we learn best, how do we be shaped and be formed by the image of God, Jesus came as the living word. And this is one of the ways that we can animate the life of Christ in generosity and in dying to self and in compassion and true renewal. So I hope you would try and experiment with this. And I would love to hear some of the reports and how you're doing as you go through it. God bless, and know that I'm praying for you. Love to hear from you. Talk to you soon.